Good morning. It is Monday, May 3rd, 2021. I'm back here for Bed Talk 289. And not sure if you can see the sign behind me, but today I'm going to talk about what seems to be the topic of the day, especially in leadership. And it is vulnerability. So bear with me. When I share this beginning with you, you might say, well, duh, of course. But I really want you to think and go a little deeper with what I'm about to say. We keep trying to figure out what is the real challenge to vulnerability. And there's a lot of pretty clear answers. But the one that I haven't heard talked about a lot is this truth that vulnerability requires vulnerability. What does that mean? Well, what I'm talking about is demonstrating or modeling vulnerability for people around us requires that we be vulnerable in order to do that internally. So I'm going to be internally vulnerable, expose myself to some risk of judgment, how I'm going to be seen, etc., in order to be externally vulnerable. So let me say that again. External vulnerability, behaving in ways that demonstrate to others vulnerability, requires us to internally be vulnerable. So that's the challenge because vulnerability necessarily involves risk. If there's no risk in it, it's not a vulnerability. And vulnerability is this tricky thing because I've said this for several years now in talking to teams and audiences and leaders. If I say, hey, who wants to be vulnerable right now? It's easy to say, whoa, 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 no, because if I'm vulnerable, I'm at risk. And doesn't it make sense logically to say I want to avoid being at risk, which means I avoid being vulnerable, which means I'm unable to express myself and model and demonstrate vulnerability. So I just want you to think about that. It is the risk that we face internally that tells us protect, protect, protect. Don't be vulnerable. And as a result, we don't show up as vulnerable. Now, there's a lot more to this. I just want to stick with that today. Just paying attention to the reality that vulnerability externally requires vulnerability internally. In order for me to show you vulnerability, I have to be willing to be vulnerable in here. Let's start with that. Let's talk about what's our fears, our hesitancies, those risk factors, those risk alarms that go off that say, no, 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 protect, protect. Don't let them know. Don't let them see you. Don't give them something to possibly judge you. But that is really the step we need to look at as leaders. The internal vulnerability and the limits we put on it and the safety mechanisms that come online. Because when we pay attention to those and more aware of those, then the external outcome is the vulnerability that people are seeking so that they can connect with us, so that they can trust us, so that they can know us. So that's it for today. Vulnerability externally requires vulnerability internally. That's it for today. Keep taking care of yourself and everyone around you. And by all means, stay connected.